village of Upper Brambleton wore the quiet hush of autumn like a shawl about its shoulders, the streets dimly lit by lanterns swaying in the crisp October air. Halloween had a way of making the familiar lanes seem both inviting and menacing, as though the shadows themselves waited with secrets best left untold. On that particular night, when the bells of St. Jude's tolled 11, an air of foreboding clung to the small village, though none could yet say why. By dawn, they would know. Sir Edmund Pemberton was a man of means and eccentric reputation. He lived at the edge of the village in the grand but slightly decaying manor that bore his family's name for 3 generations. Pemberton Hall was a place whispered about by children and resented by some adults, a symbol of wealth in decline, the grandeur tarnished by rumour. Sir Pemberton himself was known to host peculiar gatherings, though the villagers dismissed most as harmless eccentricities. But this Halloween, something had transpired that no one in Brambleton could explain, something that would bring Miss Marple, with her gentle but unyielding wisdom, into the heart of a puzzle wrapped in shadows. It began with a locked study. Sir Pemberton had entertained a handful of acquaintances that evening, a modest gathering by his standards. Dr. Lionel Greaves, his physician, Clara Henshaw, a widowed neighbour, Arthur Latham, the family solicitor, and his young niece Emily visiting from Bath. The party was subdued, marked by strained conversation and more silences than laughter. At 10:30, Sir Pemberton excused himself, declaring he must attend to private business in his study. He carried with him a small silver key on a chain, locking the heavy oak door from within. The guests thought little of it, assuming it was one of his usual habits. By midnight, the household was shaken awake by a scream. Emily, pale and trembling, insisted she had heard a dreadful noise from behind the study door. The others rushed to investigate, finding the door still locked, the keyhole firmly turned. Calls into the room brought no reply. Latham demanded the door be forced, and with effort the group managed to break it open. What they found was enough to chill even the most sceptical heart. Sir Pemberton sat slumped in his armchair by the cold fireplace, eyes wide open, staring at something that was no longer in this world. His face bore no wound, no mark of struggle. The decanter of brandy by his side remained full, his glass untouched. The window was locked from within, the heavy curtains drawn. There was no weapon, no sign of intrusion, no indication of poison, not even the faintest odour that might suggest it. It was as though life itself had abandoned him in silence. But stranger still was the clue left upon his desk. Laid neatly upon the blotter was a single playing card, the ace of spades, its surface marred by what appeared to be a child's scrawl. In thick black ink, 3 words had been written across it: "The Pact holds." The card lay face up, deliberately placed. No one admitted to having seen it before. Clara Henshaw, wringing her hands, swore it had not been there when Sir Pemberton left them for his study. Latham muttered something about childish pranks, but his voice lacked conviction. The police arrived swiftly, led by Inspector Graves, a man not without competence but too easily baffled by puzzles that refused neat solutions. He examined the locked windows, the unmarked body, the absence of weapon or poison, and declared it a most unusual business. The playing card he dismissed as a distraction, nonsense as he called it, but privately he looked unsettled. No one could explain how Sir Pemberton had died, or what "the Pact holds" could mean. It was Emily, her voice trembling, who whispered the word that made everyone glance uneasily at one another. Halloween. She reminded them, in a near whisper, that her uncle often spoke of pacts and bargains made on All Hallows' Eve. Stories dismissed as drunken ramblings now rang with peculiar resonance. Pemberton had once claimed that every 7 years he was bound by a promise made in his youth, though none could determine whether he spoke in jest or madness. And now, in the dead of night, with a locked door, an untouched brandy glass, and a card declaring "The Pact holds," the whispers of the villagers began to creep into the manor's high corridors. When Miss Marple arrived the following morning, summoned at Emily's desperate urging, she did not stride with authority or bluster as Graves had done. She simply sat quietly, her eyes observing what others overlooked. She noted the unlit fire, the precisely placed card, the locked windows and doors. She touched the glass of brandy. still cool, and frowned softly, though she said nothing. In the hall, she listened as the guests retold their accounts, catching every hesitation, every over-eager denial. It was not merely the absence of evidence that made the crime so strange, but the very deliberate presence of something inexplicable, a message without context, a death without cause, a door locked against reason itself. To the police, it was impossible. To the villagers, it was sinister. To Miss Marple, it was precisely the sort of puzzle that concealed its truth behind ordinary human weakness: greed, fear, envy, or folly. And yet, as the autumn wind rattled the windows of Pemberton Hall, one could not help but wonder if, just this once, something otherworldly had kept its bargain. The card lay waiting, silent and damning, its words seared into every mind. The pact holds. The crime for now remained unsolved. The answers, if they existed, were hidden in plain sight, waiting for Miss Marple to unweave the tangled threads of lies, secrets, and an old man's Halloween pact. Miss Marple arrived at Pemberton Hall just as the October sun strained to pierce the heavy clouds, casting the manor in a pallid half-light. She looked very much out of place in the grand hallway, her neat hat slightly askew from the wind, her gloved hands folded upon one another, her manner quiet yet curiously steady. Where Inspector Graves bustled with constables and barked questions, Miss Marple simply stood in silence, her eyes moving slowly across the room, as though the wallpaper, the faint smell of smoke, and the arrangement of furniture each whispered something of significance. Emily, pale with exhaustion from the night's ordeal, greeted her with relief. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't know who else to turn to. They keep saying it was—" She faltered, eyes darting toward the closed study door, now marked with police tape. "They say it was natural causes, but how can it be? Not with that card." Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost gentle. "People often believe death must announce itself with drama, my dear, but the truth is far quieter. Still, the presence of something so pointed as a message upon a card— no, that will not do. Someone wished to be heard." She patted Emily's trembling hand, then excused herself to wander nearer the study, moving so lightly one might have mistaken her for a guest rather than an investigator. Inspector Graves, who had already wearied himself with declaring there was nothing unusual, frowned at her presence. "With respect, Miss Marple, this is a police inquiry. You'll forgive me if I say that family friends muddy the water." She looked at him with mild surprise. "Family friend? Oh, no, Inspector, merely an acquaintance of an acquaintance. But I have found over the years that muddied waters do sometimes hide the clearest reflections. Perhaps you might allow me to sit quietly while you work. I promise not to intrude." It was said in such a mild, grandmotherly tone that Graves, though stiff, could hardly refuse. And so Miss Marple took up her place in the study, perched upon a chair by the wall, her knitting needles emerging from her small bag. The clicking of yarn began, soft and rhythmic, while her eyes, keen, bright, and endlessly patient, missed nothing. The police scoured the room again. They found no fingerprints on the card save for Sir Pemberton's faint trace, though it seemed curiously smudged, as if touched and then wiped. No glass of brandy bore lip marks. No traces of medicine or powder lined the rim. Graves announced once more that it must be the heart, sudden failure, nothing sinister. But his gaze lingered uneasily on the ace of spades. It was Miss Marple who first observed the peculiar detail that others ignored. "Sir Pemberton," she said softly, "was left-handed, was he not?" Dr. Greaves, startled, nodded. "Yes, always was. Why do you ask?" Her needles clicked again. "Only that his pen rests upon the right-hand side of the blotter, as though placed for convenience to a right hand. A small thing, but people are careless when they arrange a scene to appear untouched." The constables shifted uneasily. Inspector Graves muttered, "Coincidence." Papers moved, pen shifted, hardly unusual. Yet his tone lacked conviction. Miss Marple's eyes then strayed to the hearth. "And there, Inspector, do you not find it curious?" Sir Pemberton sat by an unlit fire, though the night was chill and he an old man known to feel the cold. And see there, a single cinder upon the rug, as though something small and smouldering had been thrown hastily into the grate, but the fire was never lit. How very odd. Graves pursed his lips. Perhaps an earlier fire before the evening? Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed softly. Or perhaps someone wished to destroy a thing quickly and misjudged the flame. She glanced back to her knitting, as though it were of no consequence at all. The guests of the house were called again, one by one. Clara Henshaw, nervous and fluttering, insisted she had been in the drawing-room throughout, never nearer than the corridor outside the study. She trembled when speaking of the card, declaring it ghastly, simply ghastly, though Miss Marple noticed she glanced away when Inspector Graves asked whether she had ever seen it before. Arthur Latham, the solicitor, spoke with practised composure. He muttered about superstitious nonsense, and claimed Sir Pemberton had enemies of imagination only. Yet when pressed, his hands twitched against one another, betraying agitation he strove to hide. Emily was last, her face pale and drawn. She admitted to hearing a strange sound before raising the alarm, a muffled thud, like a chair scraping or something falling. Graves dismissed it as nerves, but Miss Marple listened closely, filing the detail away. When the questioning ended, Miss Marple lingered with Emily in the hallway. "My dear, did your uncle often speak of pacts or bargains? You mentioned something of the sort last night." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "He used to frighten me with stories when I was little. Said he'd made a pact when he was a young man. Some promise that bound him, especially on Halloween. He always laughed after, but not in a kind way. More as though he were daring me to believe him." Her voice faltered. "Do you think it's true? Could it be—" Miss Marple touched her hand gently. "In my experience, when people speak of bargains and pacts, they often mean only that they have given up something, or compromised themselves in ways they dare not confess. The supernatural is very seldom needed to explain human mischief, my dear, though it does provide excellent cover for it." As evening fell again, the household grew restless under the inspector's orders to remain available for questioning. Miss Marple retired briefly to her room, yet she carried with her the image of the misplaced pen, the unlit fire, the hastily discarded cinder, and she could not help but recall the look on Clara Henshaw's face when the card was mentioned. Too stricken, yes, but not with surprise. No, Miss Marple had seen many a guilty face hide behind an excess of horror. Downstairs, Inspector Graves busied himself with reports, but Miss Marple, returning quietly to the study, paused at the desk once more. Her eyes rested not on the card this time, but on the blotter beneath. It bore the faintest impression, the ghost of words written upon a sheet now gone. She leaned close, adjusting her spectacles, and traced with her fingertip the faint outlines, the beginning of a word, the curve of letters that might have been "pa," before fading away. Someone had written upon that paper, then removed it. But why leave the card so prominently displayed, unless the card itself was meant to be seen, while the true message was destroyed? She glanced again at the grate, imagining a half-burnt page curling in weak flame. Yes, there was something here, something meant to mislead, and something else meant to vanish. When she straightened, the knitting needles clicked once more. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. "How very curious," she murmured, her eyes shining with quiet certainty. "One always finds, Inspector, that the truth hides in the smallest of things." And with that, the web of deception began to show its first strands, invisible to all but the sharp eyes of an elderly woman who saw more than she let on. The next morning at Pemberton Hall carried with it a heavy stillness, the sort of hush that clings to a house in mourning but also in suspicion. The autumn air seeped in through the old window panes, chilling the rooms despite the fires Inspector Graves had ordered lit. Constables moved about with notebooks and measuring tools, but none seemed any closer to an explanation. Sir Edmund Pemberton's death still wore its cloak of mystery, and though the official word leaned towards sudden failure of the heart, the words scrawled across that solitary playing card continued to gnaw at everyone's mind. Inspector Graves gathered the guests once more into the drawing-room for formal questioning, his manner brisk, his voice edged with irritation at the lack of progress. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner, busied her hands with knitting, yet missed nothing. She had found, over many years of quiet observation, that people betrayed themselves not by what they confessed, but by what they sought to conceal, and concealment often took the form of eagerness or silence. Arthur Latham, the solicitor, was the first called. He entered with the calm poise of a man accustomed to scrutiny, his suit immaculate, his expression measured. Graves asked him to recount the evening. We dined together modestly. At 10:30, Sir Pemberton excused himself to his study. I remained in the drawing-room with Mrs. Henshaw. Emily went upstairs for a time, and Dr. Greaves joined us later. At no point did I approach the study door until Miss Emily raised the alarm. "Did you notice anything unusual in his manner when he retired?" Graves pressed. Latham gave a carefully calculated shrug. "Only that he seemed preoccupied. Sir Pemberton was not a man of light spirits, as you know. He often withdrew early, and I did not consider it unusual." Miss Marple's needles clicked, steady and soft. She caught the faintest tightening at Latham's jaw when he mentioned Pemberton's preoccupation, as though he knew more than he admitted. She also noticed how he avoided looking at the inspector directly, his gaze lingering instead upon the fire as though hoping his words would drift away into the smoke. Next came Clara Henshaw, fluttering and pale. She clutched at her handkerchief and spoke in breathless rushes. "I was with Mr. Latham in the drawing-room almost the entire time. Yes, indeed I was. I never left his company. Sir Pemberton seemed very distracted during supper, very unlike himself. He hardly ate a thing, you know. And then that dreadful scream. Well, poor Emily. None of us will forget it. It was simply horrid. Horrid." Graves asked if she had ever seen the playing card before. Clara's eyes widened with a little gasp. "Good heavens, no. Why should I? I can't bear even to look at it. Such things have no place in a decent home." Yet Miss Marple, watching her closely, saw the way Clara's hand trembled not with sudden fear but with sustained effort, as though maintaining a pose too long. It struck her as curious that Mrs. Henshaw insisted on her constant presence with Latham, unprompted, repeating it as if to cement it in the minds of all. Too eager, too rehearsed. Emily was next, her face drawn with fatigue. She sat timidly, speaking with the quiet hesitation of the young. I had gone upstairs truly only for a few minutes to fetch a shawl. I was coming down again when I heard it, a noise from the study, a dull thump like something falling, and then silence. That is when I screamed. "You saw no one in the corridor?" asked Graves. "No, no one," she whispered. "But it was very dark." Her eyes darted briefly toward Mrs. Henshaw before lowering again. Miss Marple did not miss it. Last was Dr. Greaves, who entered with professional detachment, though his eyes were shadowed with unease. He was the one most insistent upon natural causes, the one most dismissive of sinister explanations. I have attended Sir Pemberton for several years. His heart was weak, his constitution poor. It would not surprise me in the least that it failed him. The card, of course, is a grotesque jest, perhaps left by some prankster, but medically I see no reason to suspect foul play. "And yet," Miss Marple said softly from her corner, her voice polite but firm, "you declared the death natural before examining him with care, did you not? I find that curious, Doctor. Most physicians I know would hesitate before pronouncing certainty without thorough inquiry." Dr. Greaves stiffened, then forced a whole-fee smile. "Experience, Miss Marple. One learns to recognize such things." But his eyes betrayed irritation, perhaps even a flicker of fear. When the questioning concluded, the group sat in uneasy silence, the fire crackling in the grate. Inspector Graves muttered about conflicting accounts, none solid enough to establish sequence or motive. Miss Marple, however, leaned back in her chair, her knitting needles resting still for a moment as she turned over what she had heard. Each witness had told the truth, or part of it, but not the whole. Latham admitted to distraction in Sir Pemberton, but avoided its cause. Clara Henshaw was over-anxious to prove her constant company, a fact no one had challenged. Emily spoke of a noise she alone had heard, and her nervous glance betrayed more than she wished revealed. And Dr. Greaves, well, his too ready dismissal of unnatural causes rang with something more than medical certainty. Contradictions whispered between their lines. If Clara had been with Latham throughout, why did she emphasize it so much? If Emily had only stepped away briefly, why had no one noticed her return until the scream? And if Sir Pemberton's heart had failed him, why the theatrics of the card, the careful placement of pen and blotter, the faint trace of something burnt in the grate? Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind working as steadily as her hands. People lied for many reasons: fear, greed, jealousy, or self-preservation, but their lies were seldom perfect. Already she saw the gaps where truth might slip through. It was only a matter of time before one of them betrayed the shape of their deception. As the wind howled faintly outside and the shadows lengthened in the old hall, the sense of unease deepened. A death without wound, a message without explanation, and a house filled with voices that spoke too much, or not enough. Miss Marple knew the murderer was among them, cloaked not in supernatural pacts, but in the very human habit of deceit. And deceit, she had always found, left threads loose enough to tug. She would wait, and she would listen. The truth was already present in the room. It only needed the patience of a keen eye to coax it into view. Miss Marple had always believed that the truth, like a weed in a tidy garden, had a way of forcing itself to the surface no matter how carefully people tried to cover it. That morning, with the guests and household members confined to the oppressive walls of Pemberton Hall, she began gently, almost invisibly, to tug at the tangled roots of their stories. Everyone had given their accounts, and each account carried small cracks. But what interested her more was why those cracks existed. People lied, yes, but seldom without cause. Causes, after all, were the motives that lay beneath. She began, as she so often did, by turning her thoughts to money. Sir Edmund Pemberton was not as wealthy as his ancestors had been, yet he remained the master of considerable land, investments, and property. Arthur Latham, as his solicitor, knew better than any what would become of that estate. Miss Marple, under the guise of asking after Emily's welfare, gently drew Latham into conversation in the hall. "I dare say Sir Pemberton's affairs were in good order," she murmured, her knitting resting on her lap. Latham's eyes narrowed just a fraction. Quite in order, yes. He was meticulous in such matters. "Ah, and I suppose his niece will benefit greatly?" "Emily?" He gave a short, sharp laugh. "Not greatly, no. Sir Pemberton was not a generous man, though he provided for her modestly. The bulk of his estate is directed elsewhere. Charities, trusts, that sort of thing. I can assure you, Miss Marple, there is little fortune to be gained from his death." Too quick, Miss Marple thought, far too quick to dismiss. His words rang with truth, but his eagerness to steer suspicion away from inheritance suggested knowledge he did not wish exposed. If there was little for Emily, who then gained? And why did Latham, who must have drafted the documents himself, seem so intent on quelling questions? Mrs. Henshaw presented a different kind of motive, envy, and perhaps desperation. A widow of comfortable but not ample means, she had long coveted the prestige of association with the Pembertons. Her presence at the gathering had been one of habit. She hovered near Sir Edmund's household as though proximity alone might anchor her place in its orbit. Miss Marple noted the bitterness in her voice when she spoke of Emily, the way her eyes darted with irritation whenever the girl was mentioned. "He was so fond of Emily," Clara said once, almost spitting the name, as though she could understand him better than the rest of us. Silly girl, really, but he listened to her. Miss Marple merely nodded, filing the words away. Fondness could breed jealousy, and jealousy could drive actions one would never imagine oneself capable of. Emily herself was more puzzle than suspect. Timid, grief-stricken and young, she seemed the least likely to conspire in anything so dreadful. Yet Miss Marple knew well enough that innocence could conceal desperation. If Emily truly inherited little, might she have wished for more? Or perhaps her motive was not material at all, but born of fear, the fear of whatever pact her uncle had spoken of, the kind of fear that might drive a girl to terrible measures to escape it. Still, when Miss Marple looked at her pale face and trembling hands, she sensed not calculation, but confusion, as though Emily too were ensnared in the web without understanding its full shape. Dr. Greaves was another matter. His insistence upon natural causes troubled Miss Marple deeply. Physicians often sought to reassure families by downplaying sinister possibilities, yes, but Greaves had been almost forceful in denying any suspicion before evidence had even been weighed. That suggested something more personal. She recalled overhearing him late the previous night, speaking in low tones with Inspector Graves about debts at the gaming tables, debts whispered in the public house. Sir Pemberton, perhaps, had refused him aid. Or perhaps Greaves feared exposure of some medical neglect, some truth that would mar his reputation. Fear, too, could be motive enough. Yet none of these alone explained the playing card. That message, the Pact holds, had not been placed by chance. It was theatrical, deliberate, a flourish designed either to terrify or to mislead. Who among them would think in such dramatic gestures? Latham, methodical and dry, seemed ill-suited to such flair. Emily, frightened and young, would hardly dare. Dr. Greaves, pragmatic, would prefer medicine to melodrama. But Clara, yes, Clara with her nervous fluttering, her taste for gossip and ghost stories, Clara might seize upon such a device, half believing in its sinister weight herself. Still, Miss Marple knew better than to accept the simplest alignment of motive and means. People wore masks, and the mask one expected them to wear was often the very one they donned to deceive. As the day waned, she took a slow turn about the gardens with Emily, the crisp leaves crunching underfoot. "My dear," she said gently, "tell me about your uncle's stories of his pact. Did he ever name another party in this bargain of his?" Emily frowned, searching her memory. He never named anyone, only said that he had made a promise long ago. Sometimes he said it was to a friend, sometimes to an enemy. Once, she hesitated, once he told me it was to a woman, but he was laughing, so I thought it a jest. Miss Marple's knitting bag hung lightly from her arm. She said nothing for several moments, letting Emily's words settle. A woman. That narrowed the field. A woman connected to Pemberton's past, perhaps even seated in the drawing-room now. That evening, as the household gathered for supper under the inspector's watch, the atmosphere grew taut. Latham's formality hardened into silence. Clara's chatter became brittle. Emily hardly touched her food, and Dr. Greaves drank more heavily than was his habit. To the casual observer, it was a table of weary mourners. To Miss Marple, it was a tableau of motives jostling for dominance. Greed, jealousy, fear, revenge, they were all there, interwoven, obscuring the true cause of Sir Edmund's death. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple reflected on the tangle before her. Each had reason, yet no single reason explained the peculiarities of the case. The locked room, the untouched brandy, the misplaced pen, the burned scrap in the grate, and the card with its ominous scrawl. The web of deception was wide, but somewhere within it lay the one thread that, if pulled, would unravel all the rest. She smiled softly into her cup. People thought of her as a quiet old woman, harmless and kindly. That was always the advantage. For while others shouted, lied, and postured, she listened. And in listening, she had already begun to hear the faint tremor in their voices, the tremor of those who feared discovery. The maze of motives was intricate, yes, but even the most twisted garden path led somewhere in the end. And Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and patient steps, was already walking it. Inspector Graves was never a man to let a case hang too long without resolution. The longer suspicion lingered in the air, the more it clung to him, threatening his authority. By the third day after Sir Pemberton's death, he was restless, prowling the study as though answers might tumble from the shelves, if only he glared hard enough. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, knitting, her needles clicking like a clock keeping time, watching the inspector's frustration build. It was then that one of the constables entered with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Found this, sir, in the ash heap near the kitchen garden. Someone tried to burn it, but the rain must have kept it from catching fully." Inside lay a half-charred piece of paper, brittle and blackened around the edges. Graves handled it triumphantly, smoothing it onto the desk. Across its centre were faint but legible words in Sir Pemberton's hand. "I revoke my promise." The room stirred with shock. Clara Henshaw gave a little gasp. Arthur Latham leaned forward sharply, and Dr. Greaves muttered under his breath. Emily paled, staring at the words as though they were some curse written in fire. Graves straightened with satisfaction. "There you have it, The old man attempted to destroy this note, but our culprit thought it safer to finish the job. A clear link to his talk of a pact, and proof enough someone feared he would break it. This, ladies and gentlemen, gives us both motive and method. Method? Asked Miss Marple softly, her voice mild. Murder, Graves declared. What else could it be? Sir Pemberton meant to revoke his promise, and someone bound by that pact, saw to it he could not. He turned his stern gaze toward Clara Henshaw, whose hands twisted her handkerchief to tatters. You, madam, were the closest confidant. He spoke to you of his promises, did he not? And it is your handwriting that resembles the scrawl across that card. An amateur attempt to conceal the truth, but too clumsy to succeed. Clara let out a shrill protest. Inspector, how dare you? I never, she broke off, her face blotched with fear. I had nothing to do with it. You were here in the drawing-room, Graves pressed. You admitted yourself you were with Mr. Latham the entire time. Too insistent on it, if you ask me. You had opportunity. You had jealousy for motive. And here, he tapped the charred note, here is your reason. The inspector's declaration brought a murmur of agreement from the constables. At last, a shape to the mystery. A jealous woman, desperate to cling to influence, terrified of losing. Her place in the household when Sir Pemberton severed his promises. Yes, it was neat. Almost too neat. Miss Marple watched Clara's protest grow wild, her eyes darting to each corner of the room for help, only to find none. Emily shrank into herself, Doctor. Greaves shook his head in grim disapproval, and Latham remained as still as stone, his lips pressed tight. But neat solutions rarely satisfied Miss Marple. She leaned forward, peering at the charred note, and spoke with quiet precision. Inspector, do forgive an old woman's curiosity, but would you not agree the words, I revoke my promise, sound oddly formal for a private note? Graves frowned. Formal? Yes, she said gently. As though written for a document, not for one's own reflection, it reads very much like the phrasing one might find in a will, or in a legal draft. And notice, too, how it begins mid-thought. I revoke my promise. What promise? To whom? A letter to a friend or an oath in some contract? And why write it here in the study only to burn it half an hour later? The inspector waved his hand. Mere quibbling. The gist is clear enough. Sir Pemberton wished to sever some pledge. Mrs. Henshaw feared that pledge was her own advantage. She silenced him. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes twinkling faintly. Ah, but there we encounter a difficulty. If Mrs. Henshaw feared discovery, why leave behind the card so prominently displayed? And why, Inspector, would she write upon a playing card? A strange, theatrical flourish, don't you think? I've observed that Mrs. Henshaw's handwriting is indeed a fluttering thing, but the scrawl on that card was bold, almost forceful, very unlike hers, more the hand of someone accustomed to a firm signature. She allowed her gaze to drift ever so slightly toward Arthur Latham. Latham's eyes met hers for an instant before he looked quickly away. The inspector bristled. You would dismiss the evidence, then? Do you suggest the paper was planted? Miss Marple's needles clicked once more, steady as a heartbeat. Planted, or perhaps repurposed. It seems to me the words may not have been meant as a confession at all, but as part of some legal phrasing. Our dear Mr. Latham would know much about that, would he not? The destruction of such a note might suggest Sir Pemberton meant to alter his will, revoke a clause, perhaps even retract a promise of inheritance. That would place motive in other quarters entirely. Latham stiffened. Speculation, he snapped, though his voice cracked faintly. Pure speculation. Yet Graves, eager for resolution, pressed on. Enough! The matter is clear. Mrs. Henshaw, you are under suspicion for the murder of Sir Edmund Pemberton. You will remain in custody until further evidence is gathered. The widow cried out, her face crumpling as two constables moved to escort her away. Emily buried her face in her hands while Greaves muttered something about inevitable hysteria. But Miss Marple sat back, her eyes distant. Something in her bones whispered that this was not the end. Clara Henshaw might be vain, jealous, and foolish, but she was no murderer. No, the true culprit was clever. Clever enough to stage a locked-room death, clever enough to burn one message while planting another, clever enough to let suspicion fall exactly where it now did. The false victory had been declared, the inspector satisfied, yet Miss Marple knew the game was far from over. The real hand behind the crime was still concealed, waiting with patient cunning for the moment when all others had been disarmed. And as the wind rattled through the bare branches outside Pemberton Hall, Miss Marple quietly resolved that she would not let the shadows claim another triumph. Somewhere, in the contradictions, in the too-perfect puzzle, the truth lay hidden. She need only find the thread and tug. Miss Marple remained in a quiet corner long after Clara Henshaw had been escorted away, her knitting needles clicking softly as she let her mind wander over the strands of the case. The charred note, the card, the locked study, the untouched glass of brandy, all these peculiarities had demanded attention, yet her instincts told her that the true motive lay not in yesterday's petty jealousies or last night's theatrics, but in a chapter far older, a story no one currently in the house had chosen to recall. Her opportunity came when she sought out Emily, who had withdrawn to her room, pale and frightened. Sitting by the window with the girl, Miss Marple asked softly, "Emily, you have lived here some time, and yet your uncle's family or his acquaintances must have known one another long before you arrived. Do you know of any events, disagreements, or old disputes that your uncle ever mentioned, perhaps in passing?" Emily shook her head at first. "Not really. He never spoke about anyone from the past in detail. Just hints. A word here, a warning there. He liked to scare me with them, mostly stories about the village long ago, but—" she hesitated. "He did once mention a quarrel with a Mrs. Greaves. I don't know the details, and he never explained why, but he said it had something to do with property, debts, and betrayal." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Greaves? Not Dr. Greaves?" "Yes. A distant relative, I think. Perhaps his cousin. He said she had been very angry about an inheritance when he was young." That tiny slip, the faint, almost forgotten recollection, tugged at the loose threads of her mind. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the library, where the shelves were lined with local history and family archives. She took down a large ledger, dusty and fragile, recording deeds, wills, and other legal matters, stretching back decades. Page after page turned beneath her fingers until she found a notation that made her pause. A contested claim over property in Upper Brambleton, involving a Pemberton cousin and a woman named Clara Henshaw, years before her marriage. The dispute had been settled quietly, with Sir Edmund acting as mediator. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The past, it seemed, had never truly been left behind. Clara Henshaw had not merely been a social hanger-on or a casual observer in the household. She had once been directly connected to the fortunes of the Pembertons in a far more personal way. And Dr. Greaves, whose nervous insistence on natural causes had seemed so overdone, had also been connected through family lines, though less directly. Both had had reason to watch, to remember, and perhaps to fear the consequences of old debts and broken promises. She recalled the card again. "The Pact holds." That was not merely a playful or theatrical flourish. It was a reference, veiled but precise, to something old and binding, something made in youth and memory that had never been truly settled. And the attempt to burn the note, the partial destruction of a legal or formal record, now seemed less a random act than a desperate effort to erase a link to the past before it could become a weapon. The pieces began to align. Latham's interest in the wording of the charred note, the rapidity with which he dismissed Clara, the way Dr. Greaves had argued for natural causes, all suggested more than coincidence. Each acted to obscure connections that were older than the night itself. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Emily's words, the casual mention of Mrs. Greaves, the faint unease in Clara's eyes, and the careful placement of that ominous card. Later that afternoon, she invited Latham to walk with her in the gardens. The inspector, now confident of his resolution, had left to process the arrest of Clara Henshaw, leaving Miss Marple free to pursue her own inquiries quietly. "Mr. Latham," she said in her mildest, most conversational tone, "you have long been Sir Pemberton's solicitor. I imagine you know well the history of this family and its connections in the village." He straightened, but there was an edge in his posture. "I do what is required of me. The rest is history, Miss Marple, and history rarely matters when the present is so plain." "Ah, "But history does matter," she replied. "Sometimes a forgotten quarrel, a sealed agreement, or an old debt has far-reaching consequences. You, a solicitor, would have had knowledge of every settlement, every inheritance, every contested claim. And some of those matters involve people who are still very much alive, do they not?" Latham's fingers twitched at his side. "I suppose so, but I fail to see your point." Miss Marple looked at him carefully. "Consider, for instance, the quarrel you mediated years ago, the one that brought Clara Henshaw into the Pemberton orbit. She was involved, was she not?" He swallowed, his face tightening. "It was a matter of family negotiation, now long resolved." "And yet," Miss Marple persisted, "so long resolved that it still influences behaviour tonight. There are debts of pride, of perceived wrongs that are not erased by legal documents. People remember what they consider insults or missed advantage, and some act to correct them." A shadow crossed his face, and for the first time Latham's poise faltered. Miss Marple nodded slightly, not pressing, but allowing him to feel the weight of her observation. Later, she pieced together the timeline once more, connecting yesterday's testimony with the records she had found. Clara's insistence on being in the drawing room, her repeated emphasis on proximity, began to look less like an alibi and more like a carefully rehearsed attempt to divert suspicion. Dr. Greaves' preemptive defence of natural causes gained a new colour, perhaps an attempt to protect not only himself, but those connected to past disputes he knew would surface if certain documents or statements were discovered. Even Emily's frightened recollection now carried weight, hinting at conversations overheard or stories half-remembered, passed down from Sir Edmund in moments of quiet confidence. The house grew dim with the early evening, the cold creeping through the cracks of the old walls. Miss Marple sat by the fire in the now empty study, considering the past's weight on the present. It was clear that the murder was not a simple matter of greed or jealousy in the immediate moment. It was layered, rooted in events long ago, in grievances and obligations that had never truly been resolved. And as she traced her finger along the faint smudge of letters on the desk, letters that had begun a word, vanished in flame, yet hinted at threats older than any of the living witnesses, she felt the familiar thrill of discovery. A crime, she mused, was never simply about the night it occurred. It was about the accumulation of years, memories, grudges and promises, threads intertwined until one snapped and all the others were set in motion. Miss Marple understood now that the present deception was only the tip of a far deeper iceberg. The shadows of the past had crept into Pemberton Hall that night, and while Inspector Graves celebrated his premature victory, the true pattern waited, silent, deliberate and patient, for someone perceptive enough to see it. She smiled faintly, knitting needles poised, her eyes steady on the flickering flames. "Ah," she murmured, "so many secrets, and yet so many tell their stories if you only know how to listen." Miss Marple had long understood that the human mind, when pressured, betrayed itself in the most peculiar ways. Words might be polished, alibis rehearsed and demeanour controlled, but subtle reactions, tiny hesitations, the flicker of an eye, the curling of a lip, could reveal far more than the most careful testimony. That evening, as the household gathered again in the drawing-room under the dim, flickering light, she resolved to employ an unconventional approach, a method drawn less from logic or deduction than from quiet psychological observation. She began with something seemingly innocuous, a casual recounting of Sir Edmund's final evening. Her voice was soft, almost conversational, drawing the household into memory without accusation. "It was a crisp night," she began, and the wind carried a faint chill through the corridors. Sir Edmund, as always, preferred the warmth of his study. I wonder what he might have thought if he had known all that would unfold here shortly after. The words hung in the air like smoke, and she allowed a small, deliberate pause. Eyes followed her gaze from the fire to the mantel, from her knitting bag to the charred remains of the hearth. All seemed to hang on her tone, waiting for the next phrase. She shifted slightly as though adjusting her knitting. "I've been thinking about the note we found, the words, 'I revoke my promise.' Curious phrasing, don't you think? One imagines Sir Edmund considering carefully the ramifications, and perhaps someone else watching closely." Her glance fell first on Clara Henshaw. The widow sat stiffly, her hands gripping her handkerchief. She flushed faintly, a shadow of distress passing across her eyes. Emily, pale as ever, shifted in her chair but made no other movement. Dr. Greaves leaned back, hiding any reaction behind professional indifference. Arthur Latham, however, froze entirely. His eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening around the arm of the chair, and for the first time in her observation Miss Marple noted the faintest tremor in his jaw. She allowed the moment to settle, then with the gentlest of probes she spoke again, addressing the entire room. Sometimes one leaves traces not in what is written but in what is erased. The partial destruction of a document, the deliberate placement of a card, these are in essence communications. Yet they are also tests, a way to see how others will react. People react differently under observation, yes? Some with fear, some with guilt, and some with the impulse to correct what they perceive as an accusation. Her knitting needles clicked once, punctuating her words. And it is remarkable how quickly a small hint can elicit a response, a twitch, a glance, a tightening of hands. I find it endlessly fascinating. Clara, as Miss Marple had expected, remained defensive but consistent. I have already told you, Miss Marple. I had nothing to do with it. I was with Mr. Latham the entire evening. Every word is true. Surely I have no reason to lie. Emily's face, pale and drawn, offered no contradiction. She fidgeted with her shawl, eyes downcast as though seeking reassurance in its folds. Dr. Greaves cleared his throat. I fail to see the necessity of speculation. The night's events are obvious to any competent observer. Sir Pemberton died naturally. Nothing more need be said. Miss Marple nodded slowly, letting the room absorb the apparent closure. Then she turned her attention fully to Arthur Latham. "Mr. Latham," she said softly, "you have been very calm these past days, and yet I observe that the smallest suggestion of the note's wording causes some tension. Do you find, perhaps, that the phrasing is familiar?" Latham's hand stilled for a heartbeat, then flexed, betraying momentary indecision. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and sat rigid. Miss Marple allowed a faint smile to play at her lips. "You see," she continued, her tone conversational yet deliberate, "some people remember their own words more vividly than they expect. The half-erased writing, the careful placement of a card, such things might remind them of actions they hoped would remain hidden." Her eyes were kind, almost innocent, yet piercing. Latham's composure cracked just slightly, a minuscule shift of weight forward, a tightening of the lips. The inspector, unaware of the subtle interplay, frowned. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting—" "I am merely observing reactions, Inspector," she said softly. "People sometimes reveal more than they intend, especially when confronted with details that only they could recognize. The truth is, those details are not always in the paper itself, but in the responses it elicits." Miss Marple reached for the charred remains of the note and held it loosely between her fingers, as though examining the fragile edges for interest. "Notice, everyone, that the words are incomplete. I revoke my something. The rest is gone. Someone took care to remove part of the message. That act alone tells us that the person knew it held power over another, that it could be used to create fear or to misdirect suspicion, and the smallest movements, fingers clenched, eyes shifting, a sudden blush, these betray recognition. One observes quietly, and the puzzle pieces begin to move of their own accord." Latham finally spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. It was not meant to be seen. I merely handled it. I thought it safer to remove it. Nothing more." Miss Marple's needles clicked in agreement. "Indeed, that is what I suspected, and it is remarkable how the truth has a way of emerging, even when one believes it carefully hidden. You see, Mr. Latham, the attempt to conceal often provides far more information than the act itself." Inspector Graves looked from Miss Marple to Latham with suspicion and frustration. "Are you telling me, Miss Marple, that the case is not yet solved?" "Not entirely," she said gently. "We have a person of interest, yes, but the real pattern, the motive rooted in both past and present, is not yet fully revealed. Observing reactions, Noting what people choose to reveal under subtle pressure is sometimes more telling than any witness statement. In this case, a small, unconventional test, a careful look at behaviour rather than mere words, has begun to uncover the shadow hiding behind appearances. The household sat in uneasy silence, the crackle of the fire punctuating Miss Marple's words. For the first time, the veneer of calm and composure that had shielded certain individuals began to shimmer, revealing fractures beneath. She knew that, if handled with patience, these cracks would widen, each tiny slip pulling the threads of deception closer to view. As she placed the charred paper back on the desk, Miss Marple's eyes met Latham's one last time. A subtle shift in his posture, a tiny blanch of colour in his cheek, told her everything she needed for now. The test had worked, a carefully observed reaction, nothing more, and the mask had begun to falter. The case was far from closed, yet the first glimpse of truth had emerged from an unconventional approach. Miss Marple, knitting quietly once more, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Sometimes, she mused, the mind's reactions were far more revealing than the careful accounts offered in spoken words. The real criminal, patient and clever, remained in the shadows. But Miss Marple now knew which shadow to follow. The morning after her subtle test of reactions, Miss Marple returned to the study with a quiet sense of purpose. The charred note, the card, and other small items she had examined the night before were carefully laid out on the desk. The fire in the grate crackled faintly, and the weak sunlight slanted through the tall, narrow windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. Everything seemed as it had been, yet Miss Marple's instincts warned her that the fragile web of clues could unravel at any moment. She began her examination once more, retracing the edges of the charred note and re-inspecting the card with its scrawled message. There was something about the placement, the tilt, the faint smudge of ink that she had not yet considered. As she studied it, Emily entered quietly, her face still pale, clutching a thin shawl around her shoulders. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I wanted to ask, do you think someone is still in the house, watching?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to the girl. "My dear, that is always possible. People often act when they feel unseen, hoping no one notices. That is why one must be vigilant." She continued her careful examination, then reached for the charred note, but it was gone. The brittle paper, already fragile from fire, had vanished entirely from the desk. She glanced around, her heart tightening with that peculiar sense of quiet alarm. The note could not simply disappear on its own. Someone had removed it, or destroyed it, and in doing so had struck at the very evidence she needed to untangle the case. Miss Marple rose and moved through the room, scanning every surface, every shelf, and the small drawers where papers were kept. The card remained, lying innocently atop the blotter, yet its companion had vanished without a trace. The thought struck her sharply. Whoever had done this was aware of its significance. They had anticipated her, and perhaps even Inspector Graves, and had acted to conceal the truth before it could fully emerge. Her mind raced. Latham's subtle shift in posture the night before, the flush of colour that had betrayed a reaction to her questioning, suddenly assumed a new gravity. Dr. Greaves's insistence on natural causes, Clara Henshaw's nervousness, these behaviours were no longer merely suspicious. They were active attempts to divert attention, to bury the past before it could be revealed. The stakes had risen overnight. The murderer was no longer hiding passively. Now they were moving, deliberately, strategically. She summoned Emily to the window seat, pointing to the garden paths. "Do you remember who had access to the study last night?" she asked gently. Emily's fingers twined nervously in her lap. "Only Mr. Latham and Dr. Greaves, I think, and Clara, but she never went near the study." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Indeed, and yet someone has removed the note. That requires both opportunity and a certain familiarity with the household routines. It is a bold act, one designed to unsettle and confuse." The household gathered soon after for a midday discussion, summoned by Inspector Graves, who remained unaware of the disappearance. He spoke with his usual briskness, congratulating himself on the progress made, still confident that Clara Henshaw's arrest was the resolution of the case. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, observed the interactions with renewed attention. Dr. Greaves lingered near the fire, ostensibly warming himself, but his eyes flicked toward the desk repeatedly. Latham maintained his composed facade, yet Miss Marple noted how his fingers drummed faintly against the arm of the chair, betraying impatience. Clara, even under arrest, had been placed in the drawing-room under guard, her hands folded nervously, and Emily sat with her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching everyone with wide, fearful eyes. The discovery of the missing note caused a subtle stir, though Miss Marple did not reveal it immediately. Instead, she chose to test the reactions of each suspect carefully, speaking of Sir Edmund's meticulous nature and his habit of keeping important records in the study. She noted, without accusation, how each person shifted, glanced, or hesitated in response. Latham, in particular, reacted almost imperceptibly, a barely noticeable tightening of the lips and a slight forward lean, as if he were listening for confirmation of a fear he had long harboured. Miss Marple's mind traced the possibilities. The removal of the note could not have been accidental. Whoever did it had an intimate understanding of both the household and the importance of the evidence. This was no ordinary act of mischief. It was a deliberate effort to manipulate perception, to create confusion and misdirection. The murderer had decided that the web of deception must remain intact long enough for others to believe they were close to the truth, close enough to claim a victory that was, in fact, false. As the afternoon waned, she moved quietly through the corridors, retracing steps she had taken the previous evening. She noted the worn rug near the desk, the faint scuff marks on the floor, the slightly displaced chair. Nothing screamed guilt to the casual observer, yet to her practiced eyes, the subtle disturbances were almost imperceptible signs of someone having been there in secret. The disappearance of the note introduced a new element of urgency. Trust in the household had already grown fragile. Now suspicion itself had become a tool for the murderer. Every glance, every careful word, every polite interaction could mask intent. The case was no longer just about uncovering the truth of the night. It was about navigating a minefield of deliberate obfuscation, where each misstep might close the window on discovery entirely. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room as the evening fell, the firelight flickering against her calm, collected expression. She sat and picked up her knitting, the steady rhythm a comfort amid rising tension. She knew the game had changed. The criminal was no longer merely hiding. They were actively shaping the path of discovery, seeking to leave no trail except the one that misled the eyes of the unwary. And yet, she thought, the removal of the note, though bold, was not clever enough to eliminate all traces. Every action leaves a mark, however small, and every person who acts leaves a reaction that cannot be fully concealed. The vanished evidence had only increased the stakes, sharpened the challenge, and illuminated, ever so faintly, the path toward the true culprit. The shadows of the past had deepened, and the present threat had grown, but Miss Marple, quiet and observant, knew that patience, careful scrutiny, and the smallest of insights would eventually expose the truth. Someone was attempting to bury it, to claim a victory before the puzzle had been solved. But she had seen the cracks forming, and she intended to follow them to their source. In the dimming light of Pemberton Hall, the stakes had never been higher. Trust was a fragile thing, the past was reaching into the present, and the murderer was waiting. But Miss Marple was ready to meet them in the shadowed corridors, prepared to uncover every hidden action, every secret movement, and every lie that had been told. The following evening, Pemberton Hall was cloaked in a thick fog that crept through the corridors and settled in the corners of the drawing-room. Even the fire seemed to flicker with unease, casting long, shivering shadows across the walls. Miss Marple had spent much of the day quietly observing, noting every glance, every twitch, and every half-spoken word among the household members. The disappearance of the note had shifted the balance. Trust was fragile, suspicion heavy, and now, it seemed, the air itself carried a sense of impending danger. She had just returned from a walk with Emily, who clutched her shawl tightly as if it were a shield against unseen eyes, when the first scream tore through the hall. It was sharp, high-pitched, and unmistakably human. Miss Marple's heart sank as she dropped her knitting bag and hurried toward the sound. In the small study adjoining Sir Edmund's, Dr. Greaves lay sprawled across the floor, his eyes wide with shock, a thin trickle of blood at his temple. The candlestick on the desk had been knocked to the floor, bent and dented, and a faint smear of ink ran across the polished wood, as though some desperate hand had tried to scrawl a message before violence struck. Inspector Graves arrived almost immediately, breathless and red-faced. "What on earth?" he began, but Miss Marple held up a steadying hand. "It seems our murderer is not finished, Inspector. This was not merely a theft of evidence nor a manipulation of suspicion. This is a warning, and perhaps a preemptive strike." Emily clutched Miss Marple's arm, whispering, He was always so careful. Why would someone attack Dr. Greaves?" Miss Marple knelt beside the doctor, noting the angle of the blow, the absence of a struggle in the immediate vicinity, and the lack of blood elsewhere in the room. The attack had been sudden, deliberate, and executed with knowledge of where the victim would be least prepared. Whoever had done this had studied the household, its routines, and its vulnerabilities. It was not a crime of passion, but of careful planning. Graves shook his head in disbelief. "A second murder? Here? Tonight?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze sweeping the room. "And notice, Inspector, what is not here. Nothing has been taken, nothing removed, no further evidence destroyed. This attack was entirely targeted. It seems our culprit wishes to intimidate, perhaps delay the discovery of something, or perhaps prevent Dr. Greaves from speaking further." She examined the traces on the desk carefully. The ink smudge caught her attention again, subtle yet deliberate, as though someone had tried to write something hastily, perhaps a clue, or perhaps a diversion. Her mind worked swiftly, connecting threads. The previous disappearance of the charred note, the reactions she had observed in Latham, and now this sudden, precise act of violence, all pointed to a villain several steps ahead, who not only understood the household, but anticipated every move of those trying to unravel the truth. "Miss Marple," Graves said, his tone sharp with frustration, "we must secure the house. No one leaves until I'm satisfied. But I confess, this is beyond reason. How could anyone plan such a sequence?" Miss Marple stood, brushing the dust from her skirt, her eyes calm but penetrating. "The answer lies not in chaos, Inspector, but in patterns. Each act, the vanished note, the planted card, the attack, follows a deliberate sequence. Our criminal is sending messages as much as committing crimes. Each step is calculated to mislead, to test, to gauge reactions." Emily clung to her side. Do you think they'll come after me next?" Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they are using fear as a weapon to manipulate us. That is why we must remain attentive, watchful, and anticipate the next move. Panic is what the criminal relies upon. Observation is what we rely upon." The household gathered once more under the watchful eye of Graves, though the atmosphere was tense, nervous, and fractured. Miss Marple noted every interaction, every glance exchanged between the suspects. Clara Henshaw, released temporarily to sit in the drawing-room, appeared more anxious than ever, wringing her hands and twisting her handkerchief. Latham's composure remained, though a shadow of unease crossed his face when he noticed the room's new, heightened vigilance. Emily remained quietly observant, while the inspector attempted, with growing frustration, to maintain order. Miss Marple drew attention subtly to the desk in the study, remarking on Dr. Greaves' meticulous habits, and the likelihood that someone aware of those habits could predict his movements. "Observe," she said quietly, "how the study itself is a stage. Each item placed or removed, each action performed, can be anticipated by someone who understands the patterns. And tonight, our criminal proved exactly that." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. What is vital now is to recognize that these attacks are not random. The second strike tells us that the perpetrator watches carefully, moves cautiously, and acts with precision. We must consider not just who benefits from Sir Edmund's death, but who benefits from keeping the truth hidden after that death. Her eyes lingered on Latham again, noting the slight tightening of his fingers, the subtle blanch of his skin, and the way his gaze flickered to the empty space where the note had once rested. Something in his reaction was far more telling than any protestation could ever be. The tension in Pemberton Hall deepened with each passing hour. The second attack, the vanishing evidence, and the subtle manipulations had shifted the investigation from one of discovery to one of prevention. Whoever had orchestrated these events was patient, intelligent, and cruelly strategic. The criminal's reach extended into every corridor, every corner, every shadowed recess of the house. And Miss Marple, calm as ever, knew that she had only just begun to see the pattern emerge. As night fell, and the fog pressed against the windows, she resolved that the next move must be careful, deliberate, and entirely unexpected. Observation, subtle provocation, and keen attention to human nature would be her tools. The villain had taken the first step, but the game was far from over. She would anticipate the next, even if the criminal believed themselves several moves ahead. The stakes had risen dramatically, and the line between safety and danger was thin indeed. Pemberton Hall, steeped in history and haunted by past grudges, had become a labyrinth of fear and strategy, and Miss Marple, quietly knitting by the fire, understood that the solution would not come from brute force, loud accusations, or hasty judgment. It would come from patience, observation, and the careful unraveling of the human heart. The villain lurked in the shadows, confident, cunning, and cruel. But Miss Marple, with her quiet mind and inexhaustible patience, was already several steps closer to turning those shadows into light. The morning after Dr. Greaves's attack, a pale sun filtered weakly through the fog that still clung to the grounds of Pemberton Hall. Miss Marple, knitting in her usual quiet corner of the drawing-room, allowed herself a moment of reflection. The house was tense, the servants nervous, and Inspector Graves increasingly desperate, pacing like a caged animal through the corridors. Yet in the midst of the unrest, Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, sifting through every detail, every glance, every word spoken over the past week. It was in these quiet moments, when the house seemed to hold its breath, that the pattern began to emerge. At first, it was subtle, a glance, a hesitation, a slight tremor in a hand. But the more she considered each small incident, the more coherent the sequence became. She recalled the charred note and its partial destruction. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide a message, yet had left behind the card. The wording of the card, "The Pact holds," had seemed theatrical at first, almost deliberately misleading, but now it appeared to her as a signal, a clue designed to misdirect observers, while simultaneously revealing something to those who knew how to read between the lines. Her thoughts wandered to Latham. That imperceptible blanch of his cheek the night she had observed reactions to the card, the tense clenching of his hands during discussion of the note, the nervous flicker of his eyes when Dr. Greaves' injury was revealed, they were all pieces of a larger mosaic. Something about Latham's habits, the way he positioned objects, the careful calibration of his reactions now seemed significant. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag resting forgotten on the chair, and began to pace softly, her mind mapping the sequence of events. She remembered Clara Henshaw's insistence on being in the drawing-room, the way Dr. Greaves had defended natural causes, and the slight inconsistencies in Emily's recollections. The charred note had vanished, yet that too now made sense, not as a random act, but as a calculated removal designed to manipulate perception. Then a seemingly trivial detail struck her: the candlestick that had been bent in the study during Dr. Greaves' attack. It had initially appeared merely incidental, a casualty of the struggle, but she now recognized it as more than that. The placement of the object, the angle of the bend, the faint smear of ink along its base, all suggested careful planning, not random violence. The perpetrator had chosen the tool and its location deliberately, leaving just enough trace to guide attention in a particular direction. Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting needles idle, and thought back to a conversation with Emily. The girl had mentioned that Sir Edmund sometimes left small notes for himself in unusual places, tucked inside books, beneath ornaments, or behind framed photographs. These notes, simple reminders, often contained phrases that seemed odd in isolation, but were part of a larger system Sir Edmund had devised for keeping track of obligations, promises, and debts. The realization struck Miss Marple sharply. The partial note, the card, the careful placement of items, even the timing of Dr. Greaves' attack. They were not chaotic. They were part of a repeating pattern, a methodical orchestration designed to obscure a single, central truth. Each incident, no matter how seemingly disconnected, pointed back to a deliberate plan, a plan with its roots in long-standing grievances, unfulfilled obligations, and carefully concealed intentions. She considered the old family quarrel, Clara Henshaw's distant involvement, and the complex web of inheritance and legal obligations. The plot was not spontaneous, but a continuation of disputes and arrangements that had been set in motion decades before. The present actions were only the most recent manifestation of a pattern long in the making. Her eyes fell on the fireplace hearth, and suddenly the entire sequence clicked into place. The vanished note intended to revoke a promise had been partially destroyed to create confusion, while the card's bold message served to mislead both the household and the authorities. The attack on Dr. Greaves had been executed not to eliminate him, but to prevent him from revealing observations that would connect the past to the present. Each suspect's behaviour, each subtle hesitation, each small inconsistency, now aligned within this emerging pattern. Miss Marple called Emily over, showing her the card and recalling the charred remains of the note. The pattern, she said gently, was never in the words themselves, but in how they were placed, observed, and reacted to. The person who orchestrated this understood that people reveal themselves in small ways, often without realizing it. Emily's eyes widened. So, all the strange movements, the reactions, they were clues? Yes, Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. But the cleverest part is that the clues were hidden in plain sight. Those who looked only at the words or the objects themselves missed the subtle connections between actions and reactions. But we have observed them carefully, and now we can see the pattern that links past grievances to present crimes. She reflected on Latham's behaviour during her observations, the precise timing of his actions, the way he had manipulated the scene in the study. His calm exterior, once considered a sign of control, now revealed his meticulous attention to the orchestration of events. Every detail, from the charred note to the placement of objects to the psychological manipulation of the household, fit a single, coherent narrative. Miss Marple's fingers moved deftly with her knitting as she considered the implications. The villain was patient, intelligent, and cunning, but the pattern was consistent, and consistency left openings for those willing to observe carefully. Even the vanishing evidence and the second attack had followed a deliberate logic, a rhythm that could be deciphered with patience and acute attention. By mid-afternoon she had reconstructed the likely sequence of events in her mind, the original dispute from decades past, the careful orchestration of notes and signals, the manipulation of reactions to divert attention, the targeted attack on Dr. Greaves, and the deliberate concealment of evidence. Each incident, each movement, each word spoken or withheld, fit into a single, comprehensible framework. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, satisfied. The chaos that had seemed overwhelming, the confusion that had frustrated Inspector Graves, the subtle manipulations and threats, all now formed a clear pattern. The case was no longer a tangle of random events. It was a story written across time with past and present intertwined, and a single thread leading to the perpetrator. For the first time in days, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet sense of triumph. The key had been in plain sight all along, hidden not in the obvious but in the overlooked, the incidental, the subtle. And now, finally, the pattern had emerged. She glanced around the room at the assembled household, noting the anxious expressions, the careful composure, and the faint tremors in hands that tried to remain steady. The web had been revealed, the connections understood, and the next steps were clear. Follow the thread, observe the reactions, and expose the truth concealed within the shadows of both past and present. The game was no longer entirely in the villain's favour. Miss Marple, patient and perceptive, had begun to untangle the intricate design. The pattern was no longer invisible. It had emerged, and with it, the path to justice. Miss Marple had spent the better part of the morning retracing her steps through the corridors of Pemberton Hall, reviewing the sequence of events, and quietly observing each member of the household. The pattern she had uncovered the day before now served as a lens through which she could interpret not only the actions of the suspects, but the subtle signals of their inner lives, the tiny fissures in composure, the habitual gestures that betrayed hidden tension, and the carefully controlled words that nonetheless hinted at deeper truths. It was during one such moment, as she watched Arthur Latham fidget with the cuff of his coat while offering measured responses to Inspector Graves' questions, that the final piece of the puzzle began to crystallize. His nervous attentiveness, his meticulous care with the charred note, and his precise orchestration of events all pointed to more than mere opportunism. There was a motive here that transcended the usual calculations of wealth, power, or revenge. It was something far more personal, far more consuming. Miss Marple called Latham aside under the pretext of discussing procedural matters with Graves absent from the room. In her gentle, conversational manner, she began to recount the events of the past week, emphasizing details that seemed minor, almost inconsequential. The partial destruction of the note, the placement of the card, Dr. Greaves' attack, and the subtle reactions of the household to each incident. She watched Latham carefully, noting the tension that rose in his shoulders, the imperceptible quickening of his breath, the way his eyes darted to the charred remains she had preserved as a sample. "You understand, Mr. Latham," she said softly, "that small details often reveal far more than we intend. A note left unburned, a card positioned just so, the slightest tremor when observing reactions. These are not just acts of deception, they are markers of intent. And intent, once observed, can tell a story all its own." Latham shifted uneasily, his practised calm slipping ever so slightly. Miss Marple allowed a pause, giving him the space to reveal himself without direct accusation. "Miss Marple," he said finally, voice tight, I do not understand." "Surely you do not imply—" "I imply nothing," she interrupted gently. "I merely observe, and observation often leads to understanding. Tell me, Mr. Latham, did Sir Edmund ever discuss the Pemberton family history with you? The old quarrels, the disputes over inheritance, or, perhaps, personal failures that some of us would rather forget?" A flicker of colour left Latham's face, and he swallowed audibly. Miss Marple, patient as always, let the silence hang. He mentioned certain things," Latham admitted reluctantly. "Old grievances, yes. Some resolved, others left to fester. But that was long ago. What does it matter now?" "Ah, but it does matter, Mr. Latham," she replied softly, "because history, unacknowledged, often becomes a weight that people carry, and when that weight is pressed upon, it can drive actions that seem otherwise inexplicable. The past is not merely past, it can shape fear, obsession, and even the need to control outcomes." Latham's hands flexed at his sides, and he spoke in a low, strained voice. "You cannot imagine how a single act, a single misjudgment decades ago can grow into this need for closure." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Yes, I can. And I believe that this need, this fixation, is at the heart of the crimes committed here. The removal of the note, the staging of the card, the attack on Dr. Greaves, all were designed not merely to conceal, but to impose a sense of order, to correct a perceived wrong that has haunted you for years." He looked at her, a mixture of fear and incredulity in his eyes. You know?" "I observe," she said simply. "I have noted your reactions, your careful management of events, your subtle manipulations of others. You have sought to protect yourself, to prevent others from discovering what you fear may come to light, and in doing so, you have taken increasingly drastic measures. But it is not money, nor status, nor vengeance that drives you. It is the compulsion to rewrite history, to restore what you perceive as balance in a family legacy that you feel has been wronged." Latham's shoulders slumped, the facade of composure finally crumbling. "Yes," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "It was never about the money. It was never about revenge. Sir Edmund, he remembered. He knew. And I could not allow that to ruin what I had spent years building. The promises, the pacts, the quiet arrangements. If they came to light, everything would unravel. I could not let that happen. I tried to guide events, to influence reactions, to conceal the past. But it became too much." Miss Marple's eyes were calm, her tone gentle, and in your attempt to control everything, you allowed fear to dictate action, and fear, unchecked, became dangerous. The past, when it is alive in our minds, can compel acts that are otherwise unthinkable. You acted out of obsession, not malice, though the consequences were very real indeed. He nodded, the weight of confession pressing down. I see the destruction, the attacks, the manipulation. They were all symptoms of what I could not escape within myself. I thought I could manage everything, control every detail, and yet it spiraled. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet understanding. That is the nature of hidden motives, Mr. Latham. They may appear mundane on the surface, greed, jealousy, fear, but the truth beneath is often far more complex. Compulsion, obsession, and the desire to correct perceived injustice can drive actions that defy reason, yet feel entirely necessary to the one committing them. The household, summoned discreetly by Miss Marple, now witnessed the culmination of her quiet, deliberate investigation. Latham, once the picture of calm authority, was revealed not merely as a schemer or opportunist, but as a man trapped by his own sense of duty to a past that refused to remain buried. The revelation sent ripples through the assembly. Shock, disbelief, and a dawning recognition that the true motive had been invisible because it was psychological, personal, and deeply intertwined with history. Miss Marple rose, her knitting needles still in hand, and addressed the room. The crimes committed here were not for wealth, power, or vengeance alone. They were the actions of someone striving to reconcile past wrongs with present circumstance, someone compelled by obsession and fear of exposure. Understanding that is key to understanding the events themselves. Without seeing the heart of the motive, the external acts remain inexplicable. Inspector Graves, finally absorbing the gravity of the revelation, nodded slowly. So it wasn't just opportunism, it was, compulsion. That explains why the attacks, the manipulation, everything was so methodical. Yes, Miss Marple replied. The method was consistent with someone driven not merely by desire, but by a psychological need to impose order upon perceived chaos. The real crime is the distortion of time and memory, the obsession with controlling consequences that may long have been beyond anyone's power. Latham, silent now and subdued, finally allowed the weight of his confession to settle. The villain was no longer a mere suspect. He was a man revealed, shaped by obsession, fear, and an unyielding compulsion that had propelled him to extremes none could have anticipated. The hidden motive, long obscured by appearances, was laid bare, and the true depth of the crime was understood. Miss Marple returned to her chair, picking up her knitting once more, her expression serene. The tangled web of deception, manipulation, and hidden psychological drive had finally been unravelled. Justice, she knew, required understanding as well as exposure, and in revealing the hidden motive, she had illuminated the path toward both. Miss Marple had spent the morning in quiet deliberation, reviewing every step, every reaction, every small gesture that had revealed the truth of Arthur Latham's obsession. The hidden motive, the meticulous orchestration of events, and the subtle manipulations of the household were all clear in her mind. Now, all that remained was to draw him out, to allow the culmination of the investigation to unfold. She invited the household to the drawing-room in the late afternoon, a thin veil of tension settling over Pemberton Hall. The fog outside muted the edges of the world, and the fire flickered, casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls. Everyone gathered under the pretense of discussing the final observations, but in truth Miss Marple had arranged the room carefully. The charred remains of the note, now restored to a fragment of their original order, were placed conspicuously on the mantel, a silent lure for the one whose conscience was troubled and whose composure she intended to test. Latham entered last, his posture rigid, a mask of calm that could not entirely conceal the tension under his skin. Miss Marple, seated in her usual chair with her knitting in hand, looked up at him with serene patience. "Mr. Latham," she began softly, "we have had some very interesting days, have we not? The events surrounding Sir Edmund's unfortunate passing, the missing note, The attack on Dr. Greaves. All of them part of a sequence, yes? Latham's eyes flickered, a slight tightening of his lips betraying a shadow of fear. I don't understand. Sequence? Indeed, she replied, lifting her hand slightly toward the mantel. The charred note, the card you left, the careful manipulations, all were steps in a pattern that only someone intimately familiar with the household and Sir Edmund's habits could maintain, someone who knew how to guide events without leaving obvious traces. His jaw tightened imperceptibly. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle yet unyielding. It is remarkable, really, how small actions can betray intentions. The slight blanch, the tightening of a hand, the subtle hesitation when confronted with the truth. Observers might miss these things, but one must only pay attention. And when one does, the picture becomes clear. Latham shifted in his chair, and the firelight revealed a momentary pallor on his cheeks. You think I—" "Not think," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "I know. You orchestrated the sequence of events not for wealth, not for revenge, but to impose a sense of order upon what you perceived as chaos, to control a past you felt compelled to amend. Each act, the note, the card, even the attack on Dr. Greaves, was deliberate, carefully considered, and designed to conceal as much as it revealed." A tremor ran through Latham's hand as he clenched it tightly at his side. Miss Marple allowed the pause to hang, watching him closely. The room was silent except for the faint crackle of the fire and the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Then finally his voice came, low and strained. Yes, it is true," he admitted, barely above a whisper. "I did it. I thought I could control everything, ensure nothing from the past disrupted the present. But I was wrong." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her needles pausing mid-knit. "And yet the truth has a way of emerging, Mr. Latham, even when carefully hidden. You see, patterns like human behavior cannot be entirely masked. Every careful step leaves a trace, every manipulation leaves a reaction, and those reactions reveal more than even the most meticulous plan can obscure." Inspector Graves, who had been standing silently at the side, finally stepped forward, his face a mixture of relief and exasperation. "So it was you all along, Latham. You thought you could mislead us, manipulate the household, and erase your involvement. But it's over now. The evidence, the pattern, the confessions, it's all too clear." Latham rose suddenly, a flash of desperation crossing his features. "No, you don't understand. You don't see the necessity, the compulsion. I had to act. I had to protect what was mine, what I had built, what the past demanded." Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting unhurried. "And in attempting to control everything, you allowed fear and obsession to dictate actions. That is where mistakes occur, Mr. Latham. That is why the pattern, so carefully maintained, finally betrayed you. Each step, each small miscalculation, brought us closer to this moment." The tension thickened as Latham glanced around the room, eyes wide, weighing his options. His hands clenched and unclenched, a sign of the internal struggle that had driven every action over the past days. For a moment it seemed he might attempt flight or confrontation, but the calm, steady gaze of Miss Marple held him in place, a psychological grip far more effective than any physical restraint. He began again, but the words faltered. The sequence of exposure, the mounting evidence, and the quiet authority in Miss Marple's demeanour left him with no plausible escape. Finally, his shoulders slumped, the last of his facade crumbling. "I see now," he whispered, voice barely audible. I cannot undo what I have done. I am sorry." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Acknowledgement is the first step, Mr. Latham. The next will be to answer for the consequences. But do not mistake this as merely punishment. Understanding the motives, the obsessions, and the compulsions behind actions is just as vital. The mind, after all, leaves traces, even when it seeks to conceal them." Inspector Graves moved forward, placing a firm hand on Latham's arm. "You are under arrest. The case is finally resolved." The household, which had been tense with apprehension, exhaled collectively. Clara Henshaw, Emily, and the remaining staff watched the conclusion unfold, relief mingling with shock. The web of deception, the vanished evidence, the carefully staged manipulations, all had come to light, and the architect of the chaos had been revealed. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, calm as ever, her eyes meeting Graves's with quiet satisfaction. The danger had passed, the villain unmasked, and the intricate pattern of events had been fully exposed. The house, once a stage for fear and manipulation, could finally breathe again. Yet even as calm returned to Pemberton Hall, Miss Marple's mind lingered on the lesson the case had offered. That human behaviour, carefully observed, reveals truths hidden even from the most cunning minds. Obsession, compulsion, and the desire to control the past can drive people to extremes, but patience, insight, and the careful reading of patterns can bring even the most elaborate schemes into the light. Arthur Latham, subdued and escorted by Inspector Graves, offered a final hollow glance toward the group. The spell of fear he had woven was broken, and justice, tempered with understanding, had prevailed. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her chair, allowed herself the faintest smile. The final confrontation had been a test not just of cunning, but of patience, observation, and the delicate art of revealing the human heart. The case, now resolved, had proven that even the most meticulous villain could not outmaneuver quiet vigilance and careful attention to detail. And as the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected, as always, that human nature in all its complexity was both the source of crime and the key to its resolution. The day after Arthur Latham's confession, Pemberton Hall seemed to breathe again. The servants moved with lighter steps. Emily wandered freely through the corridors, and Inspector Graves, though still meticulous in his duties, allowed himself moments of relief. The charred note fragments had been collected, the card preserved, and the household had begun the slow, careful process of returning to normal. Miss Marple, quietly knitting by the fire, observed it all with the patience and composure that had guided her through the tangled sequence of events. Yet even in this fragile calm, she could not shake the lingering sense of unease. Patterns, she knew, could mislead if one became complacent, and human behaviour, capricious, cunning, and occasionally unpredictable, often concealed further layers beneath the obvious. Latham's confession, thorough and seemingly complete, aligned perfectly with the evidence she had painstakingly gathered, but Miss Marple's instincts whispered that the story might not yet be fully told. It was during the afternoon tea, as Emily poured delicate cups of fragrant Darjeeling, and Clara Henshaw fidgeted in her seat, that a subtle detail caught Miss Marple's eye. A letter, previously unnoticed, had been slipped under the door of Sir Edmund's private study. Its envelope was unremarkable, save for a faint wax seal that bore no family crest, but a simple, elegant monogram. G. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She handed the envelope to Inspector Graves. "This was not here yesterday," she said softly, "and it may well contain information that alters our understanding of recent events." Graves glanced at the wax seal, frowning. "G. Could it be a relative? A solicitor? Perhaps someone who arrived late last night?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. Observe carefully the handwriting. It is deliberate, precise, yet faintly informal. Whoever wrote this knew the household, knew Sir Edmund's habits, and knew exactly how to avoid detection. It is unlikely to be a stranger." With careful hands she broke the seal and withdrew the letter. The script was neat, almost elegant, and the words seemed innocuous at first glance. "The game is not yet finished. Observe the study at midnight." A chill passed through the room. Graves's brow furrowed. "Observe the study? At midnight? Are you suggesting another attack?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she traced the edges of the envelope, noting the faint smudges and a peculiar crease near the top right corner. It was subtle, almost invisible, but to her experienced eye it indicated someone had handled the paper in haste or nervousness. The household, drawn together by curiosity and apprehension, followed Miss Marple as she made her way to the study that evening. She moved deliberately, every step measured, her knitting bag now tucked under her arm as if it were a talisman against unforeseen dangers. Emily followed closely, her face pale in the candlelight, while Clara Henshaw lingered at the doorway, nervously clutching her handkerchief. Midnight approached, and the study was empty except for Miss Marple herself, seated quietly by the desk, observing the room. The card, the remnants of the charred note, and other evidence remained untouched, arranged precisely as they had been for weeks. Every shadow seemed amplified in the flickering candlelight, and the faint creak of the floorboards outside made her pulse quicken only slightly. She was ready, patient, and attentive. At precisely 12, the door opened softly, and a figure slipped into the room. It was not Latham. He had been securely confined since the previous day. But someone far less expected, Dr. Greaves. His usual calm composure was gone, replaced by a tremor in his hands and a subtle hesitation in his step. Miss Marple's eyes lifted slowly. "Dr. Greaves," she said softly. Knitting needles paused in her lap. "You need not attempt deception here. I suspected long before this moment that your involvement might extend beyond observation alone." Greaves froze, then stepped fully into the room, the candlelight illuminating a face pale with anxiety. "Miss Marple, I had no choice. Latham, he would have destroyed everything. The pattern you saw, he had convinced me I could protect the household only by following his instructions." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "You were acting under duress then. You assisted, yes, but your hand was not free. Yet in sending this note you reveal your own conscience, your own desire to rectify the manipulation." Greaves lowered his gaze, the weight of his secret evident in every line of his body. "I thought I could manage it. I thought I could prevent another tragedy. But the more I interfered, the more I became part of the pattern, until it consumed me." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, your conscience led you here. The final twist, then, is not merely in Latham's obsessive manipulation, but in your quiet involvement. You were both players in the same pattern, though for very different reasons." Emily's eyes widened, and even Clara Henshaw's handkerchief trembled in her grasp. Inspector Graves, finally realizing the full implications, exhaled sharply. So, the mastermind, or at least the silent architect, was not entirely Latham. Greaves, under coercion, became part of the orchestration, and it took courage to come forward and reveal the truth. Greaves nodded, his expression a mixture of shame and relief. "I see now that I cannot hide in the shadows. The household, the investigation, the truth, it all demands clarity. I was wrong to think I could control events without consequences." Miss Marple, ever calm, allowed a faint smile. "The final twist is often hidden in human nature itself, Doctor. Greaves. Fear, loyalty and compulsion can compel otherwise careful minds to act in ways that appear inexplicable, yet make perfect sense once the full pattern is revealed. Latham's obsession and your cautious involvement created a sequence of events that seemed complete, yet contained one final layer, one that required careful observation to discern." As the candlelight flickered across the study walls, the final truth settled over Pemberton Hall. The case was more complex than anyone had imagined. Latham's obsession had driven the initial crimes, but Greaves' hidden participation, driven by fear and misplaced loyalty, had ensured the pattern's continued manipulation. Only patience, careful observation, and acute attention to human behavior had allowed Miss Marple to see the last layer, the unexpected twist that clarified the entire sequence of events. The household, now aware of the full depth of the intrigue, began the slow process of rebuilding trust. Latham, contained and subdued, would answer for his compulsions, while Greaves, having confessed his involvement, faced both legal and moral reckoning. The game, it seemed, was truly at an end, and yet it had taken a final revelation, one that no one had anticipated, to illuminate the full story. Miss Marple, quietly resuming her knitting, reflected that the essence of detective work was not merely in observing the obvious, but in recognizing the subtle interplay of human motives, the unseen pressures that guide action, and the small, almost invisible details that reveal the final truth. The unexpected twist had tested her mind, her patience, and her understanding of human nature. But as always, careful attention had brought clarity where chaos had reigned. The morning after Dr. Greaves' confession, Pemberton Hall was quiet in a way it had not been since the first whispers of crime had echoed through its corridors. Sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the fog that lingered around the estate, casting the rooms in soft, muted gold. Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the fire, observed the household as it adjusted to the delicate balance between relief and lingering tension. The shadows of recent events were still present, though they no longer loomed with the same oppressive weight. Inspector Graves moved through the hall with a new sense of purpose, finalising statements and arranging for the formal detention of Arthur Latham. Latham's confession had made the immediate danger clear, yet the full truth, the psychological currents and hidden compulsions, remained something Miss Marple felt compelled to ensure was understood. Justice, she reflected, was more than a formal verdict. It required recognition of cause and effect, of human motives intertwined with consequences. She began to gather the household in the drawing-room. Emily, though still pale from the tension, sat quietly with her hands folded. Clara Henshaw, once fidgety and anxious, now seemed subdued in the presence of clarity. Even Dr. Greaves, who had openly admitted his indirect role in the orchestration of events, appeared withdrawn, as though the weight of moral responsibility was heavier than any legal consequence. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly, and all eyes turned to her. The sequence of events that has so troubled this household, she began, was carefully constructed, yet it followed a logic hidden beneath the surface. Arthur Latham's actions were deliberate, driven by a compulsion to control a past he believed demanded correction. But there was more, an auxiliary pattern, subtle yet significant, that involved Dr. Greaves, who, under pressure, acted in ways that further complicated the situation. She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to settle. The charred note, the card, the carefully placed objects, and even the timing of events were all elements in a meticulously orchestrated pattern. Latham hoped to conceal his motives through misdirection, but every human interaction carries traces of intent. Small gestures, the tightening of a hand, a hesitant glance, or a reaction to the placement of an object, all of these left clues. Emily spoke softly, almost in wonder. So all the things we noticed, the strange movements, the reactions, they were all pieces of a puzzle. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly, and that puzzle was not simply about immediate gain or revenge. It was about perception, control, and the fear of past mistakes coming to light. Latham's obsession, coupled with Greaves' fear and loyalty, created a series of actions that, if unobserved, could have seemed random, or even inexplicable. Only careful attention revealed the consistent pattern, the deliberate sequencing of events, and the ultimate motive. Clara Henshaw, trembling slightly, asked, "And justice, will it be served fully? Or—" Miss Marple's gaze was calm, penetrating. Justice, in its formal sense, will address the actions of Latham. His compulsions led to crimes that cannot go unpunished. But justice in human terms, understanding why things happened, and ensuring that the lessons are internalized by all involved, requires reflection. Dr. Greaves, by confessing his involvement, has faced that moral reckoning. The household, too, must acknowledge that fear, loyalty, and hidden compulsions can create consequences far beyond what any one individual intends. Inspector Graves, who had been listening quietly, interjected, "Miss Marple, in practical terms, Latham will face imprisonment, and Dr. Greaves—" "He will face consequences appropriate to his role," Miss Marple replied. "But the most important aspect is the awareness that actions, even those guided by fear or loyalty, leave traces. Patterns emerge, and those who observe carefully can follow them to the truth. That is why careful attention to small details, the charred note, the card, the ink smears, the subtle reactions, was so vital. Had any of these been dismissed, the true nature of events might have remained hidden." She rose from her chair, walking slowly toward the window, hands folded over her knitting bag. Every human interaction leaves a signature, a clue that reveals more than the conscious mind intends. Missed gestures, overlooked habits, or minor inconsistencies can betray even the most meticulous designs. Latham's obsession was a key example. It seemed rational to him, but the human element, the fear, the compulsion, the desire to impose order, could not be fully controlled. That is where observation triumphs over planning. A silence fell over the room, heavy but not oppressive. Each member of the household seemed to contemplate the weight of Miss Marple's words. Emily whispered, "It's unsettling, knowing that even small actions can lead to such consequences." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and that is why attentiveness, reflection, and understanding human nature are as crucial to justice as any law or punishment." The pattern was revealed because it was always in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the dots, to see the rhythm behind the chaos. For a moment, all was still. Even the flicker of the fire seemed to pause in respect for the clarity Miss Marple had brought to the intricate web of deception, compulsion, and fear. Then she looked toward Latham, who was being escorted by Graves to his formal confinement. "Justice will be served for you, Arthur," she said quietly, "but remember this. Even the cleverest schemes cannot fully outpace observation. The human element, our reactions, our impulses, our obsessions, will always leave traces that cannot be entirely hidden." As the door closed behind him, the household exhaled collectively. Relief mingled with lingering unease, for while the immediate danger had passed, the revelation of the hidden motives and the psychological complexity of the crimes left a sense that the past and the consequences of human obsession lingered in the corners of memory. Miss Marple returned to her knitting by the fire, serene as ever. The household was safe, the crimes exposed, and justice, in both legal and moral dimensions, was served. Yet she allowed herself a moment of reflection on the unsettling truth, that even in resolution, human nature's capacity for obsession, fear, and compulsion leaves shadows that cannot be entirely erased. Patterns emerge, motives are revealed, but the consequences, both seen and unseen, linger, a quiet reminder of the fragile balance between order and chaos. And so Pemberton Hall, steeped in history and now illuminated by understanding, began to breathe again. Yet the lesson endured. Careful observation, patience, and insight were the truest tools of justice, for they revealed what the eyes alone might overlook. Even when justice seemed complete, the faintest trace of human nature's complexity remained, a subtle reminder that vigilance and perception were never-ending tasks. The hall, finally still, carried the weight of revelation, reflection, and restored order, leaving Miss Marple, serene and watchful, at the heart of it all, always one step ahead. The weeks that followed Latham's arrest and Dr. Greaves' confession brought a fragile calm to Pemberton Hall. The household began to return to a semblance of normality, though shadows lingered in the corners where anxiety and past events had taken root. The servants moved more freely, Emily's laughter returned in quiet bursts, and even Clara Henshaw's habitual nervousness eased into thoughtful observation rather than constant worry. The hall's grand rooms, once filled with tension and suspicion, now carried a more subdued, reflective atmosphere. Miss Marple, as always, maintained her position at the heart of this restored equilibrium. She spent long hours in the drawing-room, knitting quietly, her gaze often drifting toward the windows and the grounds beyond. Though outwardly serene, her mind was alert, continually threading together patterns of behavior, gestures, and words, an endless tapestry of human nature that never ceased to fascinate her. One morning, a courier arrived with a small, unassuming package addressed to her. She accepted it without comment, noting the lack of a return address. Inside, carefully wrapped in plain brown paper, was a single slip of parchment with delicate, looping handwriting. On it was written one sentence: "The first shadow never falls alone." Miss Marple held the note in her hand, tilting her head as her keen eyes traced each curve of the script. Her mind immediately sifted through the recent events of Pemberton Hall, revisiting every detail she had observed, every subtle deviation from the ordinary. The note was cryptic, yes, but that was precisely its purpose, a whisper of mystery that did not demand immediate resolution, yet carried the unmistakable mark of intention. She laid the parchment carefully beside her knitting and stood, moving slowly toward the window overlooking the grounds. The morning mist drifted lazily over the lawns, and the distant trees seemed to sway with the secrets of the estate itself. Miss Marple considered the note in context, with the events that had transpired. Latham's obsession, Greaves's coerced participation, the hidden motives that had shaped every act. They had all followed discernible patterns. Yet here was a message that hinted at something broader, something beyond the immediate resolution of the crimes she had unravelled. It was not a threat nor a demand, but a gentle suggestion that the world of human behaviour, of secrets, obsessions, and unseen influences, was far from exhausted. The first shadow, perhaps Latham, had fallen and been illuminated, but others might remain. The note was an invitation to vigilance, to patience, and to continued observation. As she returned to her knitting, the familiar click of the needles seemed to echo softly in the quiet room. Each stitch, precise and deliberate, mirrored her approach to the world, careful, attentive, and unhurried, yet always aware that a single misstep or overlooked detail could alter the course of events. She reflected on the lessons the Pemberton Hall case had offered, that human nature is endlessly intricate, that motives are rarely as simple as they appear, and that even the most carefully constructed deceptions leave traces for those willing to see. Emily approached, carrying a small tray of tea, and paused as she noticed the slip of parchment. "Miss Marple," she said softly. "What is that?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes calm and unreadable. "A reminder, my dear, that even when we believe a mystery has concluded, the world continues to offer subtle hints and quiet shadows. One must never assume that all threads have been untangled. Some linger, waiting to be understood at the right moment." Emily's brow furrowed, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Do you think it relates to the case here, or something else?" "That, my dear, is the question," Miss Marple replied, lifting the note to the light and studying it once more. "It may refer to the events here, or it may point toward matters yet unseen. Either way, it is a gentle nudge to remain attentive, to watch closely, and to remember that the smallest detail often contains the greatest significance." She moved toward the study, placing the note on the desk alongside the carefully preserved fragments of evidence from the previous cases. Even in her tranquillity, her mind raced through possibilities. The handwriting suggested someone deliberate, yet cautious. The phrasing, "the first shadow never falls alone," implied connections, unseen accomplices, or patterns that had yet to surface. Miss Marple knew, with the certainty born of years of observation, that this subtle signal was more than a casual remark. It was an invitation, a puzzle, a quiet challenge that demanded discernment. The household moved around her in routine, unaware of the silent thrill Miss Marple felt at the prospect of yet another enigma. To them, the hall had been restored to safety and order. To her, it was alive with possibility, the next sequence of events already whispering from the corners and corridors. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered word could carry significance, and the mind attuned to patterns would perceive connections invisible to others. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across the grounds, Miss Marple settled once more in her chair by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. She allowed herself a faint, reflective smile. The cases at Pemberton Hall had been resolved, the immediate threats neutralized, and justice had been delivered. But the note remained, a subtle reminder that mysteries are rarely finite, that human motives are endlessly intricate, and that the shadows of the past, present, and future often intertwine. For a moment, she considered the horizon beyond the estate, the fog rolling gently over the lawns and trees, the distant silhouettes of neighbouring estates, and the unending expanse of human complexity. The first shadow had indeed fallen, but she knew instinctively that it would never fall alone. Others would emerge, small clues would appear where least expected, and the dance of observation, deduction, and human nature would continue. And so Miss Marple, serene and composed, let the quiet thrill of anticipation settle around her. The immediate dangers had passed, the mysteries had been unravelled, yet the whisper of the unknown persisted, a subtle, persistent invitation to the mind that never stopped observing. She finished her row of knitting, lifted her eyes to the flickering flames, and considered the possibilities that lay ahead. Pemberton Hall, restored to apparent peace, carried within it the traces of human obsession, cunning, and the lingering shadows of secrets yet to be revealed. And Miss Marple, as always, was ready, attentive, and one step ahead, poised for the next challenge that might arrive silently, as shadows always do. Even in resolution, the world remained a puzzle, and the detective knew the truth of it. Mysteries never truly end. They merely pause until the mind prepared to see, to observe, and to understand returns to uncover them.